In today's video, we are going to be discussing the female reproductive system, and here we have the outline of what we'll be discussing. The ovaries, the uterine tube, the uterus, the cervix, the vagina, and the vulva. Now, the ovaries are a pair of reproductive glands in the female reproductive system. We have one ovary on each side of the uterus. The ovary plays a key role in ovulation. It's the structure that releases the mature ovum into the uterine tube or into the fallopian tube. The ovary produces estrogen and progesterone, which are important hormones that regulate the development of secondary sex characteristics as well as pregnancy. Okay, so there we have the ovaries. The next structure we'd be considering is the uterine tube. The uterine tube is made of 4 parts. Okay, so in the uterine tube we have the fimbria, we have the infundibulum, the ampulla, and the isthmus. Okay, so we have a structure that looks like this. This is the uterine tube, and it's also sometimes called the fallopian tube. The fimbria part of the uterine tube is what collects the mature ovum as it's released from the ovary. Okay, the fimbria contains some cilia that beat in the ovum into the ampulla region where it's fertilized. So fertilization takes place at the ampulla. Okay. The next structure we'd be considering is the uterus itself. Now, the uterus is sometimes called the womb. Okay, the uterus is made of the body, which is this part, the body of the uterus, and on the superior part of the uterus we have the fundus. The fundus is the rounded part of the uterus that we have here. Okay, so the fundus. Then we also have the horn of the uterus. That is where the isthmus of the uterine tube is attached to. The uterus is made of 3 walls. We have the perimetrium, the myometrium or myometrium, and the endometrium. Okay, now the perimetrium is actually a part of the peritoneal layer of the abdominal cavity. So here we have the abdominal cavity, and lining the abdominal cavity is the perimetrium or the perimetrial layer. And here we can see that on the part where it gets to the uterus, it actually curves. The perimetrium curves around the uterus, okay, forming this structure that we have over here. So the perimetrium or the perimetrium is actually a part of the peritoneal layer that lines the abdominal cavity. Now, on the posterior side of the uterus, we have this perimetrium layer forming what we call the retrouterine pouch. This retrouterine pouch is also called the pouch of Douglas. And on the anterior side, we have the vesicouterine pouch. Now, why are these structures so important? As we'll get to see looking at the endometrium layer. But just before we get to the endometrium layer, let's consider the myometrium layer. Now, the myometrium layer is made of smooth muscles, and as we know from smooth muscles are involuntary muscles, so they have the ability to contract without our volition or without our will. So this myometrium that forms the uterus actually contracts during labor in order to kind of push out the baby from the uterus or from the womb. Now the endometrium, as we would see, is made of 3 layers. So during the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle, the endometrium has 3 layers that can be seen under the microscope, and these layers, we have the compact layer, the spongy layer, and the basal layer. Now the compact layer and the spongy layer together form the functional layer of the endometrium, and this layer is shed off during menstrual period. Okay, it's shed off together with the menstrual flow, while the basal layer remains during menstrual flow. Now in the first video of this series, we discussed briefly on endometriosis, and we saw that endometriosis could be a cause of infertility, and a key feature or a key characteristic of endometriosis is the development of endometrial-like tissues in regions outside of the uterus. Now remember when we discussed when we saw here the retrouterine pouch as well as the vesicouterine pouch. Now in endometriosis, or in people or in women that have endometriosis, these endometrial-like layers can actually form in the retrouterine pouch as well as the vesicouterine pouch. So with the presence of these endometrial-like tissues, implantation is likely to take place in these areas. However, normal implantation takes place in the endometrium of the uterus. So women with endometriosis are likely to suffer or are likely to encounter ectopic pregnancy. Now ectopic pregnancy is simply an implantation of the zygote outside of the uterus. Okay, so implantation is meant to take place in the uterus. Fertilization takes place at the ampulla, and when fertilization takes place, the fertilized egg moves to the uterus and it's implanted in the endometrium of the uterus. However, faulty implantation can take place at the ampulla or here in the retrouterine pouch, ectopic pregnancy. Okay, so let's take a look at the cervix. Okay, now the cervix is like the neck of the uterus. Okay, so the uterus here, we have the body of the uterus, and just before we get to the cervix, there's a small constriction here, and it's called the isthmus. Just the same way we have the isthmus at the uterine tube, we also have an isthmus of the uterus. And then coming down from the isthmus of the uterus, we have the cervix. Okay, now at the cervix we have an internal constriction. This internal constriction of the cervix is known as the internal ostium, and at the external side, closer to the vaginal side, we have the external ostium. Okay, so there we have the cervix. Now let's take a look at the vagina, which is the next structure of consideration. Now the vagina is a muscular canal. Okay, it's a muscular canal, and it's also of importance. It serves as an excretory passage for menstrual flow. It's also the structure that receives the penis during sexual intercourse, and it also serves as the inferior part of the birth canal. Okay, so here we have the vagina. Okay, it's a muscular tube. So we have here. Okay, so this is the vagina. ectopic pregnancy could also take place in the vaginal wall. So we could have implantation in the vaginal wall, but because these structures are not specialized for implantation, they are not specialized for pregnancy, of course further developmental processes of the zygote would not be able to take place in these regions. Next structure of consideration is the vulva. Okay, now the vulva is the collective term for the external genitalia, and the vulva is sometimes wrongly called the vagina. However, the vagina is not an external structure, it's an internal muscular canal, as we saw here. Okay, it's an internal muscular canal and it's not an external structure. However, the vagina does have an external orifice, the vaginal orifice or the vaginal opening. However, the collective term for the external genitalia is the vulva. Now here we can see some of the structures that make up the external genitalia. We have the clitoris. The clitoris is an erectile structure. Okay, so it's a sensitive erectile structure in the female reproductive system. Here we can also see the external urethral orifice. So unlike in men, in women the urethral opening is different from the vaginal opening. So women pee from a different orifice, and the menstrual flow or menstrual blood flows through the vaginal orifice and not the urethral orifice. So there are two openings, the vaginal orifice and the urethral orifice. Then we have the labia majora, which is supplied. It's a fatty fold of tissue of skin, and it's supplied in puberty with hair follicles. We also have the labia minora and the hymen. Now the hymen is a tissue. It's a tissue that partially covers the vaginal orifice. Now there are different conditions of the hymen. We could have a microperforate, where we have the hymen covering the vaginal orifice, leaving only a small hole for menstrual flow. Okay, then we have the imperforate hymen, where the hymen totally covers the vaginal opening and leaves no exit for menstrual flow. We also have the septate hymen, where we have a tissue, just have like a band of tissue and then an opening here and another opening here. And we could also have the cribriform hymen, where we have several little holes in the hymen for the exit of menstrual flow. Okay, now the vulva is the last structure we'll be considering, and this is just a general overview of the female reproductive system. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching till the end. Bye.